Hello everyone, how are you dear students? I welcome you to our 12th literature about poetry in our course Introduction to Literature. Today our poem is going to be Robert Frost's poem Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. I hope you will enjoy it. Our poet is an American poet, highly regarded for his realistic depictions of rural life, that is, life in the village, and his command of American colloquial speech. And I mean by colloquial spoken. His work often employs settings from rural life. And that's why you can feel that he represents American romanticism. Okay, let us first start by reading the poem. Please go to your books, page 52. We are going to read the poem. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. Between the woods and the frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year, he gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. As you can see, Frost's Stopping by the Woods is a lyric, and this is not your first experience with the lyric, but I will remind you of the meaning of lyric. Often we use the word lyric to describe any fairly short, non-narrative poem, presenting a single speaker who expresses a state of mind or a process of thought or feeling. So lyrics often focus on feelings and they present a single speaker. Now the man who is presented in the story, in the poem, travels through some snowy woods on the darkest evening of the year, and he feels that he loved everything that he sees around him. The major things that the poem tackles is how an adult person thinks as he stops and wants to stay in nature itself. You see, this is romanticism in the poem. The man here wishes that he could forget all his worldly affairs, you know, all these things that busy us every day, and actually stop us from enjoying nature. He wants to forget about them and just to enjoy nature. So he wants to take a moment to look at the woods, to contemplate the woods. So to some people who read the poem, it is merely the attempt of any human being to appreciate the beauty and the wonder of nature. The poem was written around 1922, that is in the first 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century. And one of the important things in poetry, as you know, is symbolism. And the poem is rich with symbolism, although it seems to be very simple. The poem really embodies the beauty of the woods as the man stopped for a little bit of time. If you try to pick any poem written by our poet Robert Frost, I'm sure you will notice his love of nature and his adoration of its beauty. So basically, dear students, I want you to notice this. The poet wants to do something that probably every one of us would like to do, which is just to take some time for yourself, to take a break from the daily business, and to fall into the lap of nature. So probably Frost wanted to remind anyone who reads the poem that nature is very beautiful, and it is very nice to visit it from time to time. This doesn't, of course, negate the mysterious aspects of the poem and the deep meanings associated with it. Now we notice that the focus of the poem is basically on the horse, then the rider of the horse, and the evening. And the picture looks very much like a picture you might see while watching a movie. So reading the poem is really very interesting to the readers. So the poet is just there on his horse for some important business which is not mentioned in the poem, and he gets to stop by the woods for some time. The man thinks that he knows the owner of the woods and that he lives in the village, but the poet doesn't want to think about who owns the place or anything like that. He just wants to enjoy nature in a moment of solitude. And solitude, guys, means the state of being alone, away from people and noise. So he wants to be deeply involved in the beauty of the snow. So the scene itself is very, very beautiful. And he stopped for some time to immerse himself in its beauty. He wants to be deeply involved in the beauty of nature. Now, the place itself is not very familiar. And you know, often we describe unfamiliar things as odd. And here we notice how the speaker in the poem gives great importance to his horse, so much so that when he stops by the woods, he considers the reaction of the horse. That is, what his horse must be thinking. Like, for example, the horse might have a question like, why has his master stopped at an odd-looking place? It would have been normal if there had been a house or a farmhouse close by the evening, or a farmhouse close to the area during this kind of stay during the evening and the dark time of the year. So why has he held the poor creature near the woods and before a frozen lake? Probably the traveler wants to connect with nature. And the horse is the partner in the journey. But you know, the horse cannot speak or express himself and cannot really discuss the emotions that the poet has in mind. The horse is dumb. Okay, so the puzzled horse does not get any answer from his master. So how does the horse express himself? Simply by shaking his harness. You know, some people would like to have bells around the neck of the horse. So he would shake the harness bell in order to say, hurry up, master, we want to leave. It's getting too dark. So in the evening, any other sound that the poet can hear is only that of the wind and the falling snowflakes. Indeed, the atmosphere is very, very capturing. So Frost is attracted to the beauty of nature, and the entire poem is the poet's attempt to portray or to depict, or let us say to draw nature. And I think we can have the same feelings if we imagine ourselves having this calm evening with snowflakes falling, and we stand by the woods. It really pleases the nerves and clears the mind. So notice the state of being alone, the peace of the place, and the atmosphere itself is the secret behind the attraction that we have in the poem. So those woods are so lovely, and this is exactly the word that we have in the poem. The woods are lovely is used in the fourth stanza of the poem. So the woods are dark and deep. Notice the use of dark and deep. Yes, this is alliteration. So the place is so beautiful that the poet cannot resist the pleasure of watching it. He wishes to stay longer at the place, but he cannot. And his horse wants him to leave, because he and his horse have to go miles before they can have a rest. So he will go on. But he cannot help but get a magnificent view of nature with its matchless beauty. So the poem, Stopping by the Woods, is best known for its simplicity, and to find the symbolical meaning in the suitable, in the simple thing. But I feel that the clearest thing in the poem is a feeling that we all have. We want to break away from the busy life, and we want to be closer to nature. And this is often the call of romantic poets. They want us to have time in nature. So this is a theme that many poets captured in their poems. Not only American poets like Frost, but also the British romantic poets, as we said in a number of poems. So what is the most common explanation of the meaning of the poem? Actually, the prevalent interpretation of the poem is that it describes the writer's conflict between his solitude and social obligations. That is, there is an internal conflict inside the poet between his desire to be alone and to have some quiet time for himself, and his social obligations. And I mean by obligations, duties, things we have to do every day. So the subject of the poem is really stopping by the woods and feeling the peace of nature away from civilization and urban settings. The line which says, "But I have promises to keep," indicates that we have obligations, and even though we like doing something, sometimes we have to go back. The interpretation of the poem also suggests the conflict between nature and civilization, with our protagonist viewing the woods as an escape from the daily tasks required by society. So the poet starts his poem with a stanza that refers to the unseen owner of the woods being in the village and repeating the theme of solitude by stating that there is no farmhouse nearby. The poem evokes the peace found in leaving society behind. Also, we notice that the final lines of the poem, which repeat, "and miles to go before I sleep," have been widely discussed by different scholars. And some of them really came to an interpretation or an explanation that might seem to me or to you as far-fetched or not very believable. It could be that the poet is talking about death or suicide. Because one certain thing in the poem is the double meaning of sleep. If we take sleep as a metaphor, then sleep could be about a man who thinks that he wants to end his life. At the same time, he feels that he has miles to go. That is, he has many responsibilities and obligations that he has to finish before he is able to commit suicide or to die. Now, can we talk here about the meaning of or the tone of the poem? Actually, there is a discussion also about the general tone of the poem, where the speaker basically focuses on the desire to enjoy the beauty of nature, specifically snow, with all the beautiful meanings associated with the snow, which covers the forest in a dark and calm evening. Many people agree that the tone is calm and serene. Calm and serene are almost similar in meaning. Quiet and contemplative. A contemplative tone is a tone that encourages you to think and to use your mind. On the other hand, you have people who see a different tone, a totally different tone, which is that the tone of the poem is rather dark and depressing. It causes depression or sadness, let us say. Now, symbolism. You know, in literature, one of the things that we always seek is symbolism. And stopping by the woods is a grand example of symbolism. So we have a lot of important key words in the poem, like the evening, like the horse, and also snow. So the horse could be something that guides us through life, because you know the speaker rides the horse and the horse guides him somehow. Again and again, I emphasize that the poem seems to be very, very simple and easy to read, but it is rich with literary devices. If you remember early on, I mentioned metaphor, and there are some important metaphors which are implied. They are not very clear, but we notice that the poem is based on two extended metaphors. Like the last line of the third stanza. Speaking of the snowflakes, downy flake, we notice that also we have another metaphor which can be understood if we go to the last stanza, miles to go before I sleep, which is repeated here. So if we think of the first one, we notice that snow represents so many things in life, and also sleep could be death, or could be the normal sleep that we take in order to have a rest. Also, if you think of personification, which is a special form of metaphor, you notice that the horse itself is a metaphor, because it was personified as a human being who can think and can ask questions. So here the horse is seen as a human being who understands his owner's needs, or inquires if they have to stop, since they are moving and they need to stop. You know, one of the important things I mentioned in our lectures while talking about imagery is that we have types of images as many as we have senses. So we notice that our poet in this poem really focused on sight, that is, yes, visual images, such as speaking of the woods, that is the forest, speaking of the farmhouse, the lake, snow, etc. These images help the reader to achieve a purpose, or to achieve a kind of goal in understanding the poem. The readers are supposed to feel, as the poet skillfully builds up the images, we are supposed to feel the comfort or the solace, comfort or solace that a lonely traveler can feel when he goes to nature. Part of the music in the poem is also the use of alliteration that we mentioned in many lectures. Here in this poem, we notice the use of alliteration in the poem. If you, for example, go to line 1, we have whose, woods. The W in whose and woods is a good example of metaphor. We have watch, woods in line number 4 of stanza 1. We have the use of alliteration as well in stanza number 3, line number 3, sound and sweep. In the last stanza, stanza number 4, we have dark and deep. These are examples of alliteration. Also, the poet used assonance, and he repeated vowels in many lines, like using E and I. They come in a quick succession, like he will not see me stopping, and he gives his harness bells a shake. Notice the I in will and give, and notice the use of harness, shake, etc. Also, we notice the use of consonants, which is the repetition of the consonant sounds in the W and the sound. So we notice that the poet was able to achieve musical effects in his poem. Another thing that pertains to structures in poetry is the use of stanza. Did you notice that the poem is divided into 4 stanzas, and that each stanza has 4 lines? So we notice that a stanza of 4 lines is a quatrain, because qua means 4. The poet used a quatrain, which is a 4-lined stanza. And in the poem, we notice that he used a different rhyme scheme. And the rhyme scheme that is followed in the poem is A, B, A. No and though, A, here, B, and snow, B. Also, queer, near, lake, year. We notice that throughout the poem, we notice that line 1, line 2, and line 4 are the same, and the difference is in the third line of every stanza. So the third line of each stanza rhymes with the next stanza. No, though, snow rhymes with each other in the first stanza. Here rhymes with near in the second stanza. Now, did you notice the use of repetition in the poem? Let me take you back to our stanza, which is the last one. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Now, what do we call this? Actually, in poetry, this is something we call refrain. Refrain. And do you know the meaning of refrain in Arabic? I think you need to know that refrain means something like لازمة شعرية in Arabic. And لازمة in Arabic is, I think, the same as refrain in English, because both of them speak about something which is repeated over and over in poetry. Now, the fact that the poet repeats miles to go before I sleep, miles to go before I sleep, shows that these are really important lines in the poem, because refrains often reveal important aspects of the poem. The poet here embodies the conflict in the poem, the fact that we want to enjoy nature, at the same time we have to do a lot of tasks. So there is an emphasis on this conflict by using something we call refrain. So what's a refrain after all? The lines that are repeated again at some distance in the poems are called refrain. So what are we trying to say here is that Robert Frost really wrote a poem which seems to be very, very simple, but at the same time it's rich with meanings. And there has been a lot of arguments about Robert Frost's Stopping by the Woods. Some actually argue that it is simply a description of a man appreciating nature. Others would tell you that there is some heavy metaphor action going down, and that the poem is about death. Now, and I have to relate this to what I have been talking about, which is the refrain. The fact that the poet actually repeats the lines about death proves what I am trying to say, that the poem could be about the metaphorical meaning, which is death. And there are those who take it a step further and say that the poem addresses suicide. Suicide means like someone who wants to kill himself. But however, you have to take into consideration romantic people and nature lovers who see our poem as a piece that celebrates nature and scorns or hates civilization. And you probably have your own idea of what the poem means. And this is something I expect you to do in your reactions to our lecture. I would like you to write comments about whether the poem is just a celebration of nature, a poem that trumpets nature, Or is it a poem that scorns civilization and hates civilization? So, but the poem is awesome, you know, and I think you agree with me. It's really awesome. And its awesomeness lies in how it sounds rather than in what it means. You know what I mean? Yani the way the poem seem to us, the way the poem seems to us is richer than what it means. And you can do a simple thing, just listen to the sounds of the poem. And I have to remind you that Robert Frost, notice Robert Frost is not an English romantic poet, but he is an American poet who has always been associated with nature and the New England landscape or nature, and that he liked to write about nature. As a poet, he is also known for creating simple poems that can be interpreted in different ways. So it's a good idea actually to think of what the poem means to each and every one of us. And I have a question for you. Have you ever wanted to escape from the world for a little while? I'm sure you have. And this is exactly what we crave for. Like we want a little vacation from responsibilities. Sometimes we get hungry for alone time, like the speaker does in the poem. Don't you want sometimes to be away from the internet, from the phone, from the ads, from the TV, from the busy world, and you want to get to spend much time alone? Do we have time to do so? Like, do we have time to smell the roses? Actually, we are too busy. We are too busy to do so. We are busy most of the time. And that's why probably this poem means a lot to the people who want to escape from the world and to enjoy solitude. But for those who love urban life, I don't think that the poem will be very inspiring. And of course, as readers, you are free to have your own, you have your own response to the poem. Okay, so here we come to the end of our lecture about stopping by the woods. Thank you very much. Next time, inshallah, we will be dealing with something different. I think I will introduce an old form of poetry known as the ballad. After that, we're going to speak about modern poetry, and we will take the Red Wheelbarrow as a good example. And after that, we are going to conclude our lectures about poetry, and we will move to talk about drama. And probably you know that our play is going to be Oedipus the King. And here we come to the end of our lecture about Frost. Thank you very much. Don't forget to write your responses, comments, and questions under our video. Till we meet again, thank you very much. Have fun.